say was obviously welcome and to introduce myself. So I'm Brigette Hughes. I'm the assessment manager for Pearson Edexcel exams in Italy. I've worked for Pearson Italia for the last 20 years, incredible as it seems at this stage. It's such a long time. And I've been directly involved with the assessment side of things for the past 8 years, helping test centres around Italy get started with preparing students for the exams. So I'm very much sort of involved in looking after the test centres and training teachers, exams officers and so on and so forth. Just to mention a couple of things, housekeeping things, let's say, for the duration of today's webinar. So this session is now being recorded. Nobody has a webcam on, nobody has a microphone on, so there shouldn't be any privacy issues from that point of view. We will make the recordings available to you once we've finished the complete series, which is next Tuesday, the 5th of May. So once we have all the recordings, we will then make them available to you. And you can feel free to also share those with your colleagues as well. We have a question and answer panel over and above the chat panel. So if you have any specific questions as I'm going through today's webinar, please put them in the question and answer panel. That just helps Ben monitor and separate questions from just general feedback that you can put in the chat. So questions and answers in the Q&A panel, and we'll come to those at the end of today's session. Okay. So I'll just take you through the things that we're going to look at today. Obviously, we've got quite limited time, and if you feel you need any further detail, then I would encourage you to reach out to your local Pearson assessment manager. We will be providing an overview sheet with the recording. So the key points in terms of what is looked at today will be provided in a summary sheet, and the same goes for all the webinars that we've run in the past week and the ones that are to follow for the next week and couple of days. So you will have a summary document coming through as well. So feel free to make notes, but if you just want to sit back and listen equally, we will be providing the main points for you. So today we're going to look at the structure of the test. We'll look specifically at the tasks and the objectives and stimulus. By that, what I mean is what is being assessed in the individual listening tasks, what are the objectives for the students to reach, and what stimulus is provided for each task. So what is the recording type? So that we start to get familiar with what kinds of recordings students can expect to find in the exam. We'll look briefly at the scoring. We won't go into a tremendous amount of detail on this. Last week, our colleague Faith Kent from Pearson in the UK did a specific session dedicated to the scoring of the writing paper and went into fine detail on how the listening as well as the reading and writing. So you'll find more detail in her webinar from that point of view. And then we'll look at some best practice for preparing students, some practice materials, and then time for questions at the end. So before I actually go into the structure of the listening itself, I did just want to take a second to give an overview of the writing test format, to just highlight a couple of points. And this is particularly if there's anyone out there today who is just starting to teach PTE General and is just starting to get familiar with the test format. So there are two papers in PTE General. There's the writing paper and the speaking paper, and the listening tasks come right at the beginning of the writing test. So the first thing students will do, regardless of the level of exam they are taking, because with PTE General, the format of the written test is the same across all levels. It's just obviously the level of language that changes, the complexity of the tasks, the speed of the listening, the variety of the accents, and so on and so forth. But essentially, the format of the tasks doesn't change as such. across the levels. So it's the first thing students do once the exam starts. And I think one thing to always bear in mind about the listening, and listening is often a skill that students find challenging, particularly when have you know, video alongside it. This generation of students are very used to having listening supported by visual media, is that it's really the pace of the recording that is controlling what's happening in the listening test. So it's important that students not only have a lot of practice at listening in general, and then we develop skills that we're going to look at in more detail when we get onto the best practice part of today's webinar, but that really they become familiar with the timings of the exam as well, and how long the task is, how many times they will hear a recording in an individual task, and, you know, to just get sort of comfortable with the pace of the recording, if you like. So we'll come to that in a minute. The speaking test then, obviously listening isn't formally assessed here, but it is a skill that's very much put into practice. And hopefully you'll find that in the best practice tips that I'm going to share with you, there are some things that also translate to enabling students to give a better performance in the speaking test as well, because certain strategies in terms of, for example, listening for keywords and really ensuring that they've understood and interpreted what the examiner is asking. These are things that kind of move into the arena of the speaking test as well, although I do want to underline that listening is not formally assessed in the speaking test. So let's have a look at the actual tasks themselves. So we've got 3 tasks, and they follow this order. So the first one is a 3-option multiple choice, and depending on the level, those 3 options could have pictorial support. So that's at the lower levels at A1 and level 1. Or they could have words or sentences for students to choose from. In this task, students are really being asked to listen for gist, so they will only hear the recording once. In the second task, students are asked to listen to a dictation, therefore to transfer and transcribe from the listening text exactly what they hear onto paper. Here they get to listen twice, and the second time they hear the listening, it has pauses. So the first track for the dictation is with no pauses. They can just listen for overall meaning and highlight, maybe pick out some of the keywords. The second time they hear it, there will be pauses, giving them time to write down exactly what they hear. The third task then is what we call text or note completion. And students again will listen twice. And in this case, they are not required to complete sentences in the sense of completing a dictation. They are required in some way to comprehend, interpret the information they hear to be able to complete the sentences that are given for them. So they're listening for specific information here, and they are required to extrapolate information, if you like, extract information from that listening text to be able to complete the missing components, the missing words in a sentence. And here they get to listen twice. There are two sets of recordings for task 3. So we'll have a look at it with some past papers in a second. So I'll go now then to the multiple choice, the first task they come up against. This is taken from paper 3, and I've only put up 4 of the questions on the slide here, because otherwise it would have become a very crowded slide. I would have needed to have reduced it right down, so it would have been difficult to see, I expect. So students will basically have in this part of the exam, they will have an example which will show them exactly what is expected of them. as I said before, they will only hear the recording once, but they will also hear all the instructions as well. So as the recording starts, it will literally start with, this is the Pearson test of English General Level 2. This test takes 1 hour and 35 minutes. Section 1, you will have 10 seconds to read each question, etc., etc. So students do have time, if you like, to ease themselves into the pace of the speaker on the recording. And I would really strongly advise you to ensure that students really focus when this part of the recording starts, because it just gets them settled really before they actually have to start doing anything. They'll start to get used to the accent of the speaker on the recording. They'll, you know, be reminded of exactly what they need to do, and the recording will also take them through the example as well. There are obviously past papers available on the Pearson website, and afterwards we can share a link with you as to where you can find these. For those of you who are already familiar with the past papers there, I also wanted to mention that some new papers have been put up in the last week as well, so you'll find new materials there if you've already used what was provided previously. So let's look now at what is being assessed in the multiple choice question. And the objective that you see here is taken from level 2 specifically. The objective can change slightly from one level to the other. So I would always suggest that you refer to the test guide, which has all the information on the given level that you're interested in. We have test guides for every level of PTE General. So in this case, then they're being asked to listen for gist. So we are assessing the ability to understand the gist of short spoken utterances by either identifying the situation, the speaker's role, the speaker's relationship, the topic, spatial relations, a description, or recognizing the function of what they're listening to. And the stimulus at this level could be a variety of things. It could be a short transactional conversation, it could be a social conversation, a public announcement, and it could include the language functions that you see on the slide here. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you see that there's sort of, you know, request for goods or services, a variety of different language functions that could appear in this 3-option multiple choice recording. The next section is the dictation. And as I said before, this is very different because firstly, the candidates listen to the recording twice. Test takers are being asked to really put down on paper, word for word, what they hear. So they will generally listen to one person speaking. It could be more than one, but it's generally one person speaking, and they need to write exactly what is heard with correct spelling. For the dictation mark, they may make a spelling mistake. However, that spelling mistake can only be accepted if it's within certain parameters, and I'll come to that when we look at the scoring. So what we're looking for here is if there are 17 words in the overall text, that the student, to get their dictation score, that they reproduce word for word those 17 words. Okay. It's fine for students on the first listening to make notes of keywords, and it's also fine if after the second listening, when they've written out everything, they actually want to write out a tidy version of it afterwards. But what they must do in that case is they must put a line through anything that is not considered to be their answer. So it's clear to the examiner that what is on the page is intended to be considered as their final answer to the task. Here then the objective is to assess students' ability to understand an extended utterance by transcribing a spoken text. This is the objective, again, taken from level 2, the B1 level. And the stimulus could be a variety of things, from instructions, news bulletins, announcements, broadcast features, and factual information. And the extracts are descriptive and contain relatively formal language. Okay, so unlike the sort of maybe the more personal conversations and so forth in section 1, you can expect a slightly more formal register in the dictation task. Section 3 is the text or note completion task. And in this task, candidates will hear twice 2 recordings, and they could either be monologues or they could be dialogues. And what they need to do is to complete the notes or the text that they have in front of them. Okay, so you can see section 3, you've got questions 12 to 16, and then you've got questions 17 to 21. So there are 2 recordings, 2 different recordings. Each one will be played twice. And we do advise candidates here to really start jotting down their answer from the first listening that they do, so that on the second listening they can just check that that all makes sense. I think the other thing to remember is that the sentences that need to be completed in this particular example, and this is the same across all the levels, are put in the order that they appear in the text. So if a candidate at this stage is sort of seeing that they can't complete something, it's important they start looking at the next one, because the text may have gone on and they may have missed something. So it is important that they keep pace with the recording, using the questions as a guide, if you like, to keep them on track. Here then, the objective is to assess the ability to extract specific information from extended spoken text. So we're listening for specifics here rather than just overall gist. And the stimulus could be, as I said, 1 or 2 speakers giving an exchange, of information, something that in any case will require accurate listening and transcription. So there could be things like addresses, telephone numbers, dates, and they could take the form of a transactional conversation, a public announcement, or a recorded message, like a voicemail message, for example. All these details can be found in the test guide. So I've put up here just the cover of the test guide for level 2, because these are the objectives and stimuli that I've looked at in these past slides. But these guides are available, as I said, for every level of PTE General. So you can go to the website and find the one that is of interest to you and for the level of students that you're teaching. So we'll look now then quickly at the scoring. As I said, Faith Kent, our colleague from the UK, gave a very detailed webinar last Tuesday on the scoring of the writing paper, covering listening, reading and writing. So if you want the fine detail, you will find that in her webinar. As you may know, if you've been working with PT for some years, each skill within the PT General exam carries a maximum of 25 points. And this is how the listening tasks award those points. So the first one, which is the 3-option multiple choice, you have 10 points that students can aim for. There's 1 point per question, and being multiple choice, the answer is either considered to be correct or incorrect. What I would say at this stage is that if a student doesn't know the answer, it's always worth them giving giving a guess. Because if they write nothing, they'll certainly not get a point. If they guess, there is a chance that they may guess the correct answer. And feedback from Faith, who is involved on the examining side, was that they often receive papers with, you know, 3 or 4 questions with no answer at all. And it's just a shame not to try, because, you know, worst case scenario, you won't get the point, but you won't get a point anyway if you write nothing. With the listening, the dictation listening task, 5 points are available for the listening ability, let's say the listening skill, and I'll go through exactly how we come up to the total of 5 points in a second. And then the final listening task, the text completion, again, you have 10 sentences or pieces of text to be completed. Each one carries a point that can be gained. So multiple choice, either correct or incorrect, no partial credits for this activity. The dictation. So the points here are awarded based on how many of the overall words in the listening a student writes, and how many of those words are recognizable phonetic representations of the word in the recording. So, for example, if a student wrote difficult with 1 F, it would be clear to the examiner that they meant to write difficult, and that would be a recognizable phonetic representation. If they wrote difficulty or difficulties when the word was difficult, that would not be accepted. Neither would, for example, if in the dictation you had the word years as the plural of year, and students wrote years with an apostrophe before the S, because at that point it would be considered a homophone or a grammatically incorrect representation of what the word actually was. And the score of 5 then is calculated in this way. So if you have an overall text that is made up of 17 words, and the student accurately reports 15 of those 17 words, you divide 15 by 17, and that gives you a score to 3 decimal points. That is then times by 5, which is the overall number, maximum number of points a student can get, and that will produce your score. That is then rounded up or down to the nearest number, depending on where the decimal point falls. Okay. For the sentence completion, task 3, there's 1 point per question for each of the 10 sentences. And students, again, they're marked correct or incorrect. And so, again, no partial credits for this activity, no half points. Let's have a look now then at some task tips. And I wanted to start just with some general tips before going into tips that relate to the actual sort of individual sections themselves, so to speak. So a lot of these may seem fairly obvious, but in the same way as we always say to our students, read the question, it's amazing how often they don't when they're sort of under the sort of the exam conditions. So I think the first thing to say is to tell students and train students to follow the instructions text as it is played on the CD. By doing this, students will then focus on the task in hand, and they will get familiar with the sound of the voice of the speaker and the pace of the recording. So I mentioned that before, but I'll mention it again because I think it settles students into focusing on the task in hand. Do allow students to bring a highlighter into the exam, and when you're doing work on past papers with them, do get them into the habit of highlighting key words in questions to keep their focus on what the question is actually asking them. And do spend time on preparing them for the pace of the tasks as well. And by that I mean, get them familiar with whether they are going to have time to read something before a next question, whether, you know, they need to try and get the information down on the first listening, or whether they should just concentrate on keywords in the first listening with the dictation, for example. So really get them familiar with how to pace themselves and what to do when, so that they take advantage of the time that they have available, and obviously ensure that they're familiar with whether they're going to hear the recording once or twice. Because when we are teaching students, it's very common to be, you know, to use you know, to allow students to hear the recording twice, even 3 times. But here we're not teaching students now, we're assessing them. And just remember that that first multiple choice is, they only hear that once. So it's not, you know, they don't think it's coming a second time. Now then, I'll go into some tips for the individual sections. And here we have then section 1. And you have a typical instruction here for section 1. Get students to highlight the keywords in the instructions so that they are aware of the timing, and they're aware also of what is expected of them. It's just good practice to get them into the habit of doing this, because it gets them to focus. The second tip I would suggest you work on with them is that, remember in sections 1 and sections 3, there are examples provided as a model. And remind your students that by reading the example question and listening while it is read out, they will get an idea of the content and the difficulty of the questions that are going to follow. And they will sort of reflect on how they need to answer as well. So an example shouldn't be a time when students sort of power down and switch off because the real test hasn't started yet. They should use that as something to keep their focus. Okay. In sections, in section 1 in levels A1 and level 1, so A2, you can expect the multiple choice to contain visual prompts. So as you see on this slide, you've got different locations, and students have 10 seconds to prepare before each recording begins. And they should really use this again to highlight the keywords, not just in the overall instructions, which we looked at a few slides back, but actually in the individual question at this stage. So in this instance, it's what is the man describing? Okay, so the fact that they've got 3 images here of different locations, it would suggest that what they're about to listen to is a recording about a place or a building. It may mention a supermarket or a shop, or it may refer to houses. So they really need to use what information is available to them, so that as the listening starts, they're prepared for what's coming, rather than just trying to take on board what's in the pictures once the recording has started. They've got those 10 seconds, so it's important that they look at the differences between the pictures and ensure that they've got clear what they might need to listen out for. The recordings then for section 1 and particularly sort of this is something that will sort of go across all the levels, so not just for the lower levels. They will make use of a range of accents and voices. So your students may be used to hearing a more limited range of accents and voices. So it is important that when you're preparing students, that you take an opportunity to sensitize them to a variety of different accents so that they don't go into the exam just expecting to hear one kind of accent and then get completely thrown because what they hear is an accent that they've never come across at all. So ensure that when you are preparing students that you use a variety of accents just so that you can expose them to the different types of accents as much as possible. At the higher levels, again, students will still have 10 seconds to prepare each question, and they should highlight the key words in the question. But it's also important that they look at the key words in the various answers as well, because I think one thing that sometimes can throw students, and we see examples of it in this slide, is that the recording will often make reference to all three potential answers, but only one will really fit. So two are distractors, and it's important that students don't just highlight what is in the question. So in this case, it would have been what speaker doing, but they also highlight the different keywords in the options as well. So they're really focused when that recording starts. In the dictation task, I would suggest you train students to highlight what the recording is about. Because if students know what the topic of the dictation is, they can already, in a way, start to prepare themselves for the content that's going to come, because at least they've got an idea of what the subject is about. And so they just need to listen the first time to familiarize themselves with the topic that's being talked about. And as I mentioned before, maybe jot down a few key words, but on the first listening, they shouldn't try to attempt to write everything down, because there are no pauses. It's going at a natural speed, and that would be, you know, a great challenge for them. It's far better to just focus on the general meaning and the keywords in the first listening. Okay. So here I've got an example from a level 2 recording, where these are some of the keywords that have come up. So the stressed words will obviously help the students to really identify the topic. On the second listening then, this is the listening with the pauses in it. Test takers really need to keep up with the recording, because this is the last time they will be hearing it. Bear in mind that there are pauses. The invigilator will never need to pause or stop the CD. All the pauses are built in. But it is important, if a student is stuck on a word, that they don't fixate on the one word they didn't hear and then miss the opportunity to transcribe all the other words that they may have understood. So if they come across a word that they haven't heard clearly, they should keep pace with the recording and carry on. There will be time afterwards to go back and look at that text and work on predicting what the missing word or the missing words were. And the best way to do that is to look at, obviously, what came before it and what came after it. And working on prediction is an incredibly valuable sort of piece of training to do with students, because it can happen in any exam to a student that they miss the odd word, particularly when they're not stressed words. So getting them in the habit of, well, I have a plan B, I can try and predict what I haven't heard clearly, just puts them at their ease in a sense, because they won't know, however many dictations they've done, they won't know the dictation of the text that comes up in the exam. In section 3, as I mentioned before, there is an example, and the example will provide students with a model of what to expect in the following questions. So you should really tell your students that by reading the example question and listening while it is read out, they will get an idea of the content of the recording and the difficulty of the questions, and they will find out how they should be writing their answers. And they should really try and complete as much as they can on the first listening. That's because the second time they listen, then they've got a chance to ensure that what they've written is correct, or just fill in the few that they may not have managed to follow the first time. As I mentioned before, the questions come up in the order that they are in the recording. So it's also important that they keep going to keep pace with the recording. Another thing students can do, you can train your students to do rather, is to change the statements that need to be completed into questions when they've got that time in between to look at the text. Then if they change those statements into a question, how would it come out as a question? It will really help them focus on what they need to listen to in order to be able to complete the text. So a question will definitely give a more direct idea of the kind of information they need to listen for. Okay. And the other thing to do with them is to look at how to predict missing words in terms of what kinds of words are they. So is it a grammar word? What is most likely to fit in the missing gap? Is it a date? Is it a place? Is it a time? Is it a number? Is it an address? But the clues are given in the text. It just helps them focus on what they should be listening out. And whilst we've mentioned that they should highlight keywords in the overall instructions, as with the multiple choice, it's helpful to also highlight any keywords in the actual sentences to be completed as well, because again, this will just give that extra bit of focus as to exactly what they should be listening for. In terms of practice activities, I wanted to refer to something that David Booth mentioned in the Developing Reading Skills yesterday, because listening being the other receptive skill, there are some commonalities in terms of developing listening as a skill with reading, developing reading skills. And I think the first thing to take into consideration is how much test strategy work does the student need, and how much language development work and skills development work does the student need. Because if we look at how broad the levels are in the Common European Framework, and this was a slide that David showed yesterday, where you have the different levels of the Common European Framework going up towards mastery, and students at different points within the Common European Framework. You can see particularly from the A2 to the end of B2 that they are very wide bands, if you like, very wide levels, and in truth double in size, if not even, you know, even wider than the A1 and the C1 in a sense. So to ensure that a student you're preparing for a level 2, so student number 3, for example, on this diagram, is ready for the test, we really need to have that information at the beginning of our preparation course. I'm sure many of you will do a placement test at the beginning, but it is really important to understand the balance, because as a trainer, I get asked incredibly regularly for more and more and more practice tests. I rarely get asked for any additional language development or skills work for listening. And whilst doing more and more practice tests will certainly give your students a better understanding of the format of the test, and it can certainly help them develop strategies for preparing for the listening, it won't necessarily improve, in fact, it won't improve their level of listening in terms of their language level. So it's important that we get the right balance from that point of view. And fortunately, we can support you in both of those endeavours. So if I were to make a recommendation for a general language course that would really give your students plenty of resources to work on to develop listening, I would suggest Speak Out Second Edition. That is because Speak Out not only has the typical graded listening activities that you would expect to find in a general English language course, but that it also has a series of BBC video podcasts where interviewers go out onto the street and interview people who speak at a very natural pace. There's a tremendous range of accents, and it's just a course that will allow your students, even if you don't manage to do all of that work in class, it will give them a tremendous resource to work outside of the classroom as well. Because as with reading and, you know, the impact of extensive reading on improving a student's ability to read, to increase their knowledge of vocabulary and so forth, it's the exposure to different listening texts that will, over and above your formal teaching, really impact a student's level. We also then have the skills boosters, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to also inform you that as of July, we will have a brand new series of Practice Test Plus books, a version with key and for teachers, and without key for students, or with key for students if you want to give your students the version with key. There's a practice app that goes with that. There are 5 whole practice tests, one of them guided, and then gradually they become more autonomous, plenty of tips and strategies. So if you're looking for specific test prep material, then this will be coming in July. So please do contact your local Pearson person for information on that. Okay, I think we've just gone around 5 minutes over. I just wanted to take a second to show you what's coming next in our calendar of webinars. So I'll be back tomorrow, both at 10 o'clock Central European time in the morning, and then at 4 o'clock Central European time in the afternoon, looking at preparing and developing speaking skills for the PTE General. On Thursday, David Booth, our Test Development Director, is back looking at preparing writing. And then we've got revision strategies with Bartek on Friday, and on Monday and Tuesday, sessions dedicated to taking care of yourself and taking care of your students on the Tuesday. And these webinars cover everything from let's say coping with stress, mindfulness, and just general well-being to be teaching and studying for exams. So I'll hand over to Ben now. If Ben, you want to pick out any questions that have come up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Brigette. That was wonderful and very informative. Thank you. And I hope, well, there's plenty of comments saying thank you very much, and saying how informative and how useful it really was. So thank you very much.
Great.
Looking through, there's a couple of questions. Okay, so it says one of the questions is, on the practice test, it states a total of 10 marks for section 2, not 5 marks. which one
Yes.
would be correct?
That you're absolutely right. So on the dictation task, students will get a score for writing and a score for listening. So the sections 1 and 3 carry 10 marks each, and then section 2 carries 5, and that gives you 25 points for listening. Sections 8 and 9 carry 10 points each for writing, and the final missing 5 points to bring that up to 25 is in the accuracy of the spelling of the words that they have written. So if, for example, as the example I gave, if a student wrote difficult with one F in amongst the text, they would get their dictation score, they would get their listening score for that, because it is an acceptable phonetic representation of the word. The examiner doesn't have to struggle to understand what the student meant and whether they had understood that the speaker said difficult. They wouldn't get their writing mark there because it was misspelled. So I hope that clarifies things. But as I said, the webinar that Faith did last week gives you a lot more detail on that, and actually gives you several examples of what is acceptable and what isn't. So I would refer you back to that for more detail.
Thank you very much. A couple more questions about specific detail on scoring. So again, reiterating what Brigette just said, please, do take a look at the one from last week. There's a lot more detail about scoring itself, okay, and what's permissible and what is not. Leading me from that, one of the big questions, and I'll take this one, is, can you please send us the webinars? We will be making the recordings available, as Bridget mentioned at the beginning, on our website, along with a summary sheet of the key information included in each session. That will be once the whole series of webinars has finished. Okay. Another question more about courseware, this one. What about Gold Experience Second Edition?
Yeah, so Gold Experience Second Edition. I mean, we actually don't prescribe a course book for PTE General. In fact, we don't have a PTE General course book as such, because unlike some of the other exams, PTE General is really designed to assess a student's ability to communicate in English, and the task types are generally a sort of a natural extension of what you would do in any general English course book. So feel free to use Gold Experience in that sense. Gold Experience does have very specific practice, to my knowledge, for Cambridge exams in it, but it doesn't mean that you can't. It's still benchmarked to the global scale of English and to the Common European Framework. So all those objectives that you saw in terms of what was being assessed in the listening part, so where I had the objectives and then the stimulus, all those objectives are coming from the Common European Framework descriptors. So there is nothing that's just purely Pearson, if you like, in these exams. So the only reason I mentioned Speak Out was really just due to the wealth of listening materials that there are available. And another thing I would also recommend, so you'll be aware, for example, of the Pearson Graded Readers series. They are available in e-text format, where students also have the recording. And again, when we're training students, we want them to be just challenge that little bit above the level that they're preparing for, because you don't want to be giving students listening texts, even for dictations, for example, that are so out of their range that they then get demotivated and don't engage. I think listening is in a way one of the most challenging skills for students to get to grips with, because it's the speed of the speaker rather than the ability of the listener that's controlling the situation. And when a student doesn't have control, they feel uncomfortable. So it's a skill that we do need to put the work into, I think. And I think it's also It allows you to work on other things like prediction, but it is one of those skills that we do need to build up, that sort of grit and determination in students, because I don't think there are shortcuts to it. It's putting in the effort that really helps you see the improvements and the results. And that means exposure, 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 whether it's graded readers with the recordings, whether it's podcasts, whether it's watching things on YouTube. It's just getting as much exposure as you possibly can and training the ear to not, you know, not go into panic mode when you don't understand every single word, because nobody sort of speaks like an ELT course book CD where everything's graded and paced and everything else. So it's just practice, 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 really. So.
Okay, thank you very much there. And one last question for you, Brigette, and then I'll take the last one that's come up. It says that in the keys, I assume them in answer keys, we get some of them that say seed and others say anchor. What do they mean?
I don't know if that's an answer key to a practice test or to...
I assume so. I tell you what, whoever wrote that in, just so we don't go over too much, I would recommend that you contact your local Pearson assessment representative, okay? Because otherwise we could be here all day going into that. Great. So, yeah, some people are pointing out that, you know, the 1st of May is a bank holiday, so maybe we could reschedule. We did this, we want to finish the series all in one go, but also this is going out worldwide, and the same bank holidays don't apply all over the world. If you can't connect and listen in and watch it, please, you know, only a few days later, it will be available on our website. Okay. No more questions from here, just a lot of thank yous, and thank you from me as well, Brigette.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining and for supporting our series of webinars. Hope it's been useful, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow if you can join. Otherwise, do register anyway, so we will send you the recording. Thank you. Bye everyone.